A black honors student stood frozen at airport security, while his white classmate carrying the same project was waved through. The TSA agent smirked. "We've had threats from people like you before." Behind him, the teacher said nothing. The cameras were already rolling. And in 30 seconds, that silent footage would set the internet on fire. But what they didn't see was what was hidden inside the bag. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The National Math Olympiad was being held in the gleaming heart of Chicago's Innovation Hall, a venue more accustomed to TED Talks and biotech launches than high school competitions. The marble floors clicked under the polished shoes of attendees from every elite school in the country. Banners of private academies, foreign exchange schools, and gifted STEM programs fluttered above the registration booths. Every corner buzzed with future engineers, coders, and mathematicians boasting 1,600 SETs and mentors with PhDs. Yet in all the hue and sparkle, no one noticed Caleb Sanders. 17, black, wearing a navy blazer 2 sizes too big, borrowed from his uncle for special days. His calculator had a crack across the screen. His shoes weren't polished but scuffed from his part-time job stacking groceries. No prestigious school crests. No parents with LinkedIn pages touting tech startups or hedge funds. Just a name badge and a mind that could see patterns others missed. Caleb walked in with the cautious steps of someone used to being told to step out. His public school, James Baldwin High, had never even qualified for the Olympiad until this year. And even then, most believed it was a fluke, a clerical error. No coach, no sponsors, just one teacher, Leona Griggs, who had fought tooth and nail to get him here. Caleb wasn't just walking into a competition. He was walking into a place that never expected him to walk in at all. He found his seat at the far edge of the hall. There were rows upon rows of long tables, organized by school ranking. Caleb's was in the back, close to the fire exit, as if someone was preparing for him to leave early. He sat, opened his worn notebook, and quietly reviewed a problem he'd scribbled in pencil on the train. Around him, other students swapped inside jokes and warm-ups about obscure number theory and MIT summer camps. None of them looked his way. The silence around Caleb wasn't new. He'd known it since 3rd grade, when a substitute teacher asked him if he was in the wrong classroom after seeing his advanced worksheet. He'd known it in 8th grade when a guidance counselor suggested he focus more on trade skills after hearing about his dreams of being a mathematician. Every standardized test he aced only made his teachers raise eyebrows, as if the results must be a glitch. Not that kind of smart. Not from that zip code. Not with that skin. But numbers never looked at him sideways. They didn't flinch. They didn't assume. They flowed clean, true, obedient, only to logic and intuition. Caleb found safety in that. As the auditorium filled, the Olympiad judges entered. A lineup of university professors and former Olympiad champions, mostly white, dressed in tailored suits. They took their seats at the long table at the front. Among them, the most noticeable was Dr. Preston Whitlock, tall, sharp-featured, his silver hair combed into a precise side part. He wore the air of someone who had never been wrong. A tenured professor from Hanover Institute. Whitlock was known for both his brilliance and his brutal intolerance for mediocrity, or as some whispered, for non-conformity. Whitlock surveyed the crowd with cold, assessing eyes. He stood at the podium, microphone in hand. "Welcome," he said, voice smooth like oil over ice. "We're honored to host the best of the best, the mathematicians of tomorrow, the future problem solvers of a world in chaos." Polite laughter. A few camera flashes. Whitlock's gaze moved across the rows until it stopped, not for long but noticeably, on Caleb. His expression didn't change, but his pause did, as if he just spotted a typo in an otherwise perfect essay. Caleb didn't blink. He knew that look. He'd seen it at department stores, in honors classrooms, from parents at PTA meetings. The look that quietly asked, "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" The test papers were passed out. Caleb flipped his over and scanned the questions. He saw integrals curled like snakes, geometries layered in 3-dimensional riddles, number theory, wrapped in double negatives. A few of the problems made him smile. He began to write. 2 rows ahead, students snuck glances at him. A boy in a blazer embroidered with the Sigmund Stein Academy crest nudged his friend and nodded toward Caleb. Their laughter wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was coded, sharp, and echoing. Caleb pressed on. He worked fast, Not sloppy fast, not panicked, but with a rhythm. His pencil danced like a violin bow over the page, sketching out truths. What he lacked in tutoring, he made up for in late nights, second-hand textbooks, and a kind of raw, unpolished brilliance that didn't wait for validation. Halfway through, Caleb noticed movement at the judge's table. Whitlock was walking, straight down the center aisle. He stopped beside Caleb. "Name?" he asked, just loud enough for others to hear. Caleb answered, "Calm. Caleb Sanders." Whitlock nodded slowly, almost theatrically, then tilted his head and asked, "And which preparatory academy are you from?" "James Baldwin High." "It's public." The silence that followed was swift and suffocating. Heads turned. Someone coughed. Caleb didn't flinch. Whitlock offered a thin-lipped smile. "Ah, I see." He said it as if Caleb had just admitted to growing up in a swamp. He looked down at Caleb's paper. "Curious approach on problem 7, he said. "Unusual. Non-standard." Caleb met his eyes. "It works." Whitlock didn't respond. He turned, slowly, and walked back up the aisle. But before reaching the front, he stopped at the microphone again, cleared his throat, and without looking back he said, "We appreciate all attempts today, no matter how unconventional. After all, it takes courage to compete in a room full of prodigies, especially when one's background might not quite align with the rigor expected here." There was a beat of silence, then murmurs, then laughter. Caleb sat frozen. Not from shock, he had expected something, but not that. His face burned. Not in shame, in fury, in frustration, in the deep, gnawing ache of being made a spectacle before you've even been given a fair shot. He could feel everyone looking now, not at his solution, but at him. That's when the arrogant Dr. Preston Whitlock made a comment so demeaning. The entire auditorium gasped. "Let's hope no calculators are doing the thinking for anyone today." Gasps. A few muffled chuckles. A camera caught Caleb's face. And just like that, Caleb knew he wasn't competing against numbers. He was competing against history. But what no one realized was that he hadn't come to play fair. He'd come to make history tremble. Caleb Sanders hadn't touched his lunch. The sandwich Griggs packed was still wrapped in wax paper, resting uneaten beside a half-filled water bottle. He sat alone in the shadow of the janitor's closet, the only place not claimed by blazers, badges, and private school pride. Around him, clusters of prodigies formed tight circles, trading theories and test hacks over gourmet catering. Names like Bennington, Alderwood, and Vanden High were etched in gold lettering on their jackets, their conversations laced with easy confidence. Caleb didn't try to join in. He knew exactly how that would go. From the moment the morning session ended, the energy around him had shifted. Not openly hostile, but subtly exclusionary, like an unwritten rule was being enforced. Eyes slid over him without landing. Space shrunk when he approached. Even at the refreshments table, a girl from Belmont Prep had accidentally bumped into him and muttered, "Watch it," though he hadn't moved an inch. These weren't teenagers. Not entirely. They were future interns at defense labs, tech giants, and Wall Street firms. Most had been coached since age 9. They carried resumes longer than some adults, and they had been trained, maybe not explicitly, but definitely over time, to recognize who belonged and who didn't. Caleb had already been labeled. It didn't help that Dr. Preston Whitlock, the Olympiad's chief judge, made no effort to conceal his disdain. During the first break, he passed Caleb in the hallway and gave a slow, measured nod, the kind of gesture reserved for the janitorial staff, not contestants. At the second session's start, Whitlock accidentally skipped over Caleb's name when listing top scorers from round 1, only to correct it later with a patronizing, yes, Sanders, the young man from Baldwin High is." His voice had dripped with performative curiosity, as if he were naming a small village in a third-world country. The others picked up on it, not explicitly, not loudly, but enough. Caleb's table during the next round was littered with used paper towels and a tipped-over chair no one bothered to straighten. His test packet came later than everyone else's. A few questions were misprinted, the diagrams smudged, the variables blurred. When he raised his hand to mention it, an assistant judge glanced his way and muttered, "Probably not worth much anyway." He wasn't supposed to win. That much was clear. He wasn't even supposed to be comfortable. But Caleb didn't get rattled easily. He'd grown up on the south side of Milwaukee, where you learned fast how to read rooms, how to shrink when needed, and how to listen for the silence between words. He had been underestimated before, by teachers, neighbors, even his own school principal, who once suggested dropping AP calculus for something more practical. He didn't fight to be liked here. He fought to be undeniable. When Miss Griggs passed him in the hallway between rounds, she gave him a nod, subtle, firm, their own code. She knew what was happening, but she also knew Caleb didn't need pep talks. He needed space to work. So while others rehearsed formulas in packs, Caleb opened his notebook to a half-finished equation he'd been playing with for 3 weeks, a deceptively simple-looking infinite series that had stumped even university-level professors. It was a side obsession, something he discovered online, then reworked on napkins and brown paper bags. He had sketched it over cereal boxes, solved bits of it in his mind while bagging groceries. The pieces were all there. He just hadn't stitched them together yet. But now, something about the way this room treated him, about the way they expected him to fail, it sharpened his focus like a scalpel. He pulled out his pencil and began connecting steps. 1 line, then 2. His fingers moved without hesitation. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply thinking, not with ego, but with clarity. Across the room, Whitlock sat beside 2 Ivy League guest judges, sipping coffee, eyes flitting between score sheets and student performances. Every so often, he glanced Caleb's way with the weary expression of a man spotting graffiti on a marble wall. Unfortunate case, one judge muttered to Whitlock, gesturing toward Caleb. Promising, perhaps, Whitlock replied dryly. But unrefined. No academic lineage. These public school kids, they mimic patterns but rarely understand the depth. The other judge leaned back, amused. Reminds me of that student from Baton Rouge years ago. Sparked, then fizzled. Whitlock smiled politely. Precisely. Brilliance without discipline is just noise. Meanwhile, Caleb's pencil paused. His eyes narrowed, then widened. A connection clicked. One he hadn't seen before. He stared at the equation, then at the reference formula on the corner of his notebook. What had seemed like 2 unrelated patterns, a Fibonacci variation and an alternating harmonic, were actually linked by a transformation matrix he'd dismissed 2 weeks ago. He rewrote the problem from scratch, applied the function in reverse. The result was clean, beautiful, even. No tricks, no error, just proof. Something stirred in his chest. Not pride, something deeper. Satisfaction, not from impressing anyone, but from finally silencing the doubt that always lingered at the edge of brilliance. Across the aisle, 2 students peeked over at his notebook. One frowned. The other's face paled. They didn't understand what they were seeing, but they knew enough to know it was new. Caleb closed the notebook. He didn't want to draw attention. Not yet. He'd let the moment speak for itself when it was time. Later that day, during the practice round for the finals, the test moderators distributed one final exploration challenge, a famously unsolved equation pulled from the archives of failed competition questions. It had no expected solution. The judges had added it as a curveball, a sort of inside joke for the elite students to try their hand at, and inevitably fall short. When Caleb saw it, his heart rate didn't rise. He just stared. It was the problem he had just solved. Or more precisely, the problem whose deeper version he had solved. What sat on the page was the public-facing puzzle, deceptively complex, but ultimately built on the very structure he had cracked. Whitlock stood at the front, arms crossed, speaking into the mic. This final challenge isn't required, he said. But those who wish to try, feel free. It's not expected to be solved. The point is to engage creatively. He looked directly at Caleb. But of course, some problems aren't meant for everyone. Murmurs. A couple of quiet snickers. Caleb didn't react. He looked down at the paper. His fingers twitched. He had the solution. Not just an attempt. The solution. And he hadn't told anyone. Not even Miss Griggs. Because Caleb had been solving something in secret, and the answer he held in his notebook was about to shatter every smug smile in the room. The auditorium's lighting dimmed slightly as the final round of the National Math Olympiad commenced. The tension was electric. Scores had been tallied, and murmurs of the top contenders echoed through the aisles like coded warnings. There were names on everyone's lips: Julian Hart from Alderwood Academy, Samira Chen from Northbrook Prep, Darius Wells from Langston Science Magnet. All prodigies, all expected, all safe bets. Not Caleb Sanders. No one mentioned him. The scoreboard had kept him in the middle of the pack, not because he'd made errors, but because the scoring system, as subtly rigged as the room itself, had discounted the elegance of his non-traditional methods. Caleb had consistently chosen lateral solutions, unorthodox, efficient, but unfamiliar to judges conditioned by legacy, and legacy was currency here. A thick silence fell as Whitlock approached the stage, his gait slow and deliberate, the smugness in his expression sharpening with each step. He held a folder in one hand and a single sheet of paper in the other. The mic squealed briefly as he tapped it. "Final challenge," he said, voice calm, almost amused. "We decided to do something special this year." Some students straightened in their seats. Others leaned forward with wary interest. "There's a problem," Whitlock continued, long considered outside the scope of this competition. "It has appeared in graduate-level journals, but never been formally solved in this form. It's a puzzle not just of computation, but of true insight." He paused, then smiled faintly. "And today one student will have the honor of attempting it." A ripple of excitement swept through the crowd. A few eyes lit up. This was the spotlight, the moment where careers began and reputations exploded. Whitlock looked down at the sheet. "The selection is random." He didn't pull a name from a bowl. He didn't use a generator. He simply announced, "Caleb Sanders." James Baldwin High. A beat. A second beat. Then the laughter. Scattered. Low, but undeniably present. The kind that didn't come from humor, but from shared expectation. Like watching a child try to lift a barbell. Caleb didn't move at first. He stared forward, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he rose from his seat and walked to the stage. Whitlock stepped aside. "You'll have 10 minutes, he said, and there was a flicker of something behind his smile. Not confidence, not cruelty, but certainty. He believed he was sealing a fate. Caleb approached the whiteboard, the marker cool in his palm. He turned to look at the problem, and there it was. He had seen it before, not on any official document or academic test, but on a quiet night when he had stayed up late scrolling obscure math blogs. It was a variant of the notorious Goldstein convergence paradox, an open problem that defied resolution, because the solution required bending traditional logic without breaking it. At the time, Caleb had become obsessed with it, not to solve it, but to understand why it was unsolvable. For weeks he had written out variations, applied divergent series, tested matrix compressions. He had sketched the function on the side of cereal boxes, toyed with it in the middle of bus rides, even murmured variable names in his sleep. He hadn't finished it then, but the patterns had lingered. Now, standing under the hot glare of the Olympiad stage lights, Caleb felt them return, like pieces of music after silence. He picked up the marker. Then Whitlock leaned in, just close enough for only Caleb to hear. "You're about to make history, Sanders," he said quietly, "the kind that reminds everyone why some doors stay closed." Caleb's hand froze. The marker hovered above the board. He didn't turn. He didn't speak. But inside, something cracked. Not fear, but the final splintering of illusion. This wasn't a random test. It was a stage set to collapse beneath him. A trap designed not to measure brilliance, but to confirm assumptions. Every eye in the auditorium was on him. Every camera pointed toward the student with the thrift store blazer, trying to see the precise moment when he would break. He took a breath, then wrote the first line. Not a guess, not a stall, but the foundational reduction of the paradox into its converging variable, the exact approach he had begun sketching 3 weeks ago, but never dared to complete. There were murmurs immediately. A few gasps. Not from the students, they couldn't follow yet, but from a judge seated near the back. Dr. Naomi Delcourt, a visiting scholar from UCLA, leaned forward, eyes wide. "Wait," she whispered, half to herself. Caleb continued. His strokes were confident, not cocky. His pace fast, but not rushed. He ignored the cameras, the judge's sideways glances, the shifting feet of students watching with giddy anticipation. Line by line he reconstructed the impossible, reworking a structure that had stumped researchers for over a decade. Halfway through, Whitlock stood again. He approached the board, arms folded, jaw tight. "This isn't a textbook method," he said suddenly, loudly enough for the room to hear. "Are you sure you're not improvising, Mr. Sanders?" Caleb paused, then replied, his voice clear. "I'm following the logic where it leads." A few students snorted, but others, even among the elite, began to frown, not in disdain, but in confusion, because Caleb wasn't flailing. He was building something, and they could feel it. Whitlock stepped even closer. "You understand, don't you?" he said, "that originality isn't always correctness." Caleb didn't respond. He simply wrote the next step, the collapsing function that transformed the paradox into a solvable loop. Dr. Delcourt stood. That's not improvisation, she said. That's iterative compression. That's real method. Other judges began murmuring. Whitlock looked at her, then at Caleb's work. His face didn't move, but the muscles around his mouth tightened. Caleb's time was nearly up. He looked over the final part of the solution. There were no erasures, no corrections, just clarity. One more line. He wrote it, then stepped back. Complete. No applause, just silence. Caleb turned to face the judges. I'm finished, he said. Whitlock moved quickly, snatching the marker from his hand as if taking away a weapon. He turned to the audience. Thank you, Mr. Sanders, he said. Let's review. But as Whitlock turned to the board, something flickered in his eyes. A momentary flicker, almost because deep down he recognized it. The solution was not only coherent, it was right. He masked it with a nod, but the pause didn't go unnoticed. Dr. Delcourt stepped toward the board, reading quickly, eyes darting. She touched one finger to a segment and whispered. He connected the divergence path without a soft reset. Then she stopped herself. The room was silent. Then Caleb, still standing at the side of the stage, watched Whitlock lean toward the board and erase the final line. Caleb's marker paused midair, hovering just above the whiteboard where the last line had been, the line Whitlock had deliberately erased. The room had gone quiet, but not out of respect. It was the taut silence of a crowd bracing for collapse, hungry for spectacle. The auditorium lights pressed down like interrogation lamps, illuminating the sweat forming just beneath Caleb's hairline. He didn't turn around. He didn't ask why. He already knew why. Whitlock wanted him to break. Right here, in front of everyone. Let's begin again, shall we? Whitlock said, clapping once sharply. This time, with clearer justification. The smattering of laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp. It stung in its intent, the kind that doesn't mock a mistake, but mocks the existence of the one making it. Caleb stared at the space where his solution had once lived. That final line had been his anchor, the elegant convergence that pulled all the moving parts together into one perfect closure. And now it was gone. Erased not by accident, but by design. Whitlock didn't want to debate the solution. He wanted to erase him from it. A soft murmur rippled through the room. Affirmative action pick. He's stalling. Doesn't know what he's doing. Did he even understand the question? Caleb felt their voices more than heard them. Thin blades disguised as words, each one cutting just deep enough to draw silence. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. Whitlock stepped beside him, too close for comfort, too far for support. His tone was performative, loud enough for the audience to hear, the teacher correcting the errant student. You see, Whitlock said, pointing to the partially erased diagram, this assumption here, about vector bias in the matrix, that's a risky leap. Unless, of course, you can prove it. Can you, Mr. Sanders? He waited. Everyone waited. Caleb, still holding the marker, turned to face the board again. He didn't respond to Whitlock. He didn't respond to the audience. He responded only to the problem. Slowly, methodically, he began writing again. He rewrote the transformation, rebuilt the collapsed divergence, reconnected the proof in a way that was slightly different. Not because the previous one had been wrong, but because now he was forced to explain what no one else had been asked to. He spoke not to the crowd, but to the equation itself. This function doesn't violate convergence. It maps beyond it. Caleb said, his voice steady. The error isn't in the steps, it's in how the steps are expected to be presented. Whitlock raised an eyebrow. Ah, he said. Translation. You're improvising. Caleb didn't look at him. He kept writing. A boy from Sigmundstein Academy whispered loudly enough to be heard. Can he even spell polynomial? A few chuckles broke out. Caleb reached the midpoint of his reconstruction. His strokes grew bolder. He was no longer reacting. He was building again, from within. Whitlock stepped forward and offered a smirk. Would you like a hint? The room laughed this time. Louder. Caleb finally turned. His voice was quiet. Would you like me to stop solving it? The laughter thinned. Whitlock's smile froze for a second, not because he was offended, but because he had not expected a direct, poised response. His silence stretched just a little too long. Then, smoothly, he replied, by all means, continue. The value of effort lies in its courage, not its correctness. Caleb said nothing. He continued. Faster now. His hand didn't shake. His thoughts sharpened with every line. The parts Whitlock had mocked were now emerging again. Revalidated, restructured, undeniable. One of the younger judges, Professor Ahmed from Northwestern, leaned forward in his seat. Hold on, he whispered to the judge next to him. The older judge raised a brow. That's not possible. But it was happening. In front of their eyes. Line after line, Caleb unraveled what the brightest minds had fumbled for years. Not with ego, not with spectacle, but with an intuitive elegance that made the solution seem obvious in hindsight. And then he reached it again. The final line. The same one Whitlock had erased. But this time, Caleb didn't write it small. He wrote it bold, across the board, larger than the others. The line that closed the paradox with an identity equivalence so airtight, it stunned even those who didn't fully grasp the math. Then, and only then, did Caleb step back. Silence, complete, and not the awkward, patronizing kind. This was the silence of realization, of watching something shatter, quietly. Caleb turned. For the first time, he looked out at the audience. Some of them still held smirks, but those smirks had begun to tremble. Others stared in disbelief, and some looked afraid. He made eye contact with no one. He didn't need to. The math had already spoken. Whitlock remained frozen, staring at the board. For the first time since the competition began, he had nothing to say. His hands were clasped behind his back, but the whiteness of his knuckles betrayed him. Professor Delcourt stood again. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for decorum. That solution, she said, has never been written like that before. The room remained quiet. Delcourt turned to the board, studying it line by line. I'm not saying it's flawless, she said slowly. But it's original, and it works. Another judge stood. Professor Ahmed added, it's intuitive. Efficient. If this holds under review, this isn't just a correct solution. This is a new methodology. The whispering started again, but this time from the judge's table. Caleb remained still. Whitlock finally spoke. His voice low, tight. We'll need to verify this. Delcourt didn't sit. No, she said. This can't be dismissed. Not again. This needs to be evaluated publicly. Caleb blinked once, and then suddenly a camera flash. One of the students in the crowd had taken a photo of the board. Then another, and another. Phones emerged. Students snapped the work before Whitlock could react. It was already spreading. Screens lit up with uploads. Whispered text messages. Captions. The math world's quietest revolution had begun. And it was happening live. Whitlock moved quickly to erase the board again. But this time, Caleb stepped in front of it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He simply said, let it stay. Whitlock froze. Delcourt nodded. It should stay. For the first time, the spotlight wasn't just on Caleb. It was his. Then a student from the back row stood up, visibly shaking, and said, I've seen that solution before, but it wasn't in any textbook. No one moved. It wasn't the kind of silence that fills a room after applause, or even the kind that follows a wrong answer. This was the rare, razor-sharp quiet that only falls when people realize the ground beneath them has shifted. But they don't yet know how deep the crack runs. Caleb stood still, the marker capped and trembling just slightly in his hand. The equation on the board, what had once been laughed at, erased and challenged, now glowed under the ceiling lights with an eerie authority. It didn't demand attention. It commanded it. Even Whitlock, who had once stood in smug anticipation of a public failure, had gone stiff. His arms remained crossed, but now with tension. The smugness in his face had drained, replaced by something more subtle, calculation. He wasn't just shocked, he was cornered. Across the front row, a row of academic judges leaned forward. Not one reached for a red pen. Not one dismissed the board with a wave. Their expressions varied, some intrigued, others confused, one visibly disturbed, but none could deny what they were seeing. A convergence model so clean, so uniquely structured, that it didn't fit into anything they'd taught, and yet it worked. The numbers aligned, the identities balanced, the logic flowed. Caleb's solution wasn't just correct, it was original. And that, in this room of templates and traditions, was its own threat. Explain this, Whitlock said suddenly, voice sharp. Walk us through your process. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. Caleb looked at him, not with fear but with a quiet boldness that seemed to unsettle Whitlock even more. Which part? Caleb asked. The beginning, or the part you erased? A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Professor Delcourt raised an eyebrow. The air had changed, no longer a spectacle. This was becoming a reckoning. Whitlock pressed forward, voice louder now, trying to reassert control. Start from your first assumption. I want to know how you arrived at your loop identity. Caleb nodded once, stepped to the board, and without any theatrics, began. He spoke with clarity, not arrogance. Each line of logic was connected to the next, his explanation building like a melody. He didn't stumble. He didn't rush. Every term he introduced was defined. Every operation justified. Every unconventional step unpacked until it became not only acceptable, but inevitable. The room, once filled with hushed judgments and coded smirks, now sat in focused stillness. Even the students, some of whom had mocked him hours earlier, now leaned forward in the kind of involuntary attention that only real brilliance could command. At one point, Professor Ahmed scribbled something on a notepad, then stopped halfway, eyes darting back up at the board. Delcourt whispered something under her breath. Another judge began comparing Caleb's steps to a known algorithm, only to realize they weren't the same, and that Caleb's version was faster. Still, Whitlock didn't blink. This method, he said, interrupting, is unorthodox. It's not aligned with standard reduction theory. Caleb turned slightly. That's because I didn't start with reduction. I started with behavior. Whitlock's jaw twitched. Excuse me? Caleb took a breath. I looked at the pattern of collapse in the divergence series, not from the equation structure, but from how the values behave over time. I mapped convergence behavior instead of function structure. That's why the loop closes. It's not a cheat, it's a lens. It was like speaking another language, one not printed in Olympiad prep books or legacy math journals, but one that felt inevitable once heard. The type of genius that didn't come from mimicking prestige, but from reinventing the rules with instinct and raw vision. That's when it happened. A hand rose in the second row. It belonged to a guest judge, a visiting professor from the Netherlands, Dr. Willem Jansen, known globally for his work on asymmetrical systems. His voice was steady, but layered with disbelief. Where did you learn this method? The entire room turned. Caleb hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because the question wasn't as simple as it sounded. Nowhere, Caleb said slowly. I didn't learn it. I just saw it. Jansen squinted. You saw it? Caleb nodded. I started drawing out collapse paths for different series. I noticed some behaviors that didn't match traditional convergence models. So I tried mapping behaviors instead of structures. Eventually, the pattern repeated in a way that closed itself. A quiet hum filled the space, the kind that sits between reverence and doubt. Jansen stood now. But that mapping sequence, it's not published. It's been theorized, but never applied like this. In your version, it simplifies it. Caleb didn't flinch. I wasn't trying to simplify it. I was trying to understand it. Delcourt stepped forward. Can we please get a copy of this? We need to replicate the steps independently. Whitlock stepped in again, sharp. We will do that later. Right now, this remains unverified. Delcourt glanced at him, a coldness in her expression. You erased the original, and now you're stalling. Whitlock's voice grew defensive. Procedure matters. We don't validate work based on performance. But that's exactly what you tried to do. Someone muttered from the student seats. More heads turned. Students whispered. A few began to record. Caleb stepped back again. Not to retreat, but to observe. He had been tested, mocked, stripped of credibility. But now the room was turning not on him, but on Whitlock. And Whitlock saw it. His control was cracking. He turned to Caleb again. Not with authority, but with something closer to desperation. The unspoken panic of a man, realizing his grip on the narrative was slipping. Let me be clear, Whitlock said, loudly now. Even if the method holds, even if it appears structurally sound, originality alone is not grounds for praise. We must ask, why does someone like this come up with something no one else has? The word someone hung in the air, like poison. Caleb said nothing. But the silence from the rest of the room spoke volumes. Even students who had laughed hours ago now shifted uncomfortably. The implication had been made clear. The curtain was pulled. Genius wasn't welcome when it had the wrong accent, when it wore thrift store jackets, when it came from public schools in red-lined districts, when it refused to bow. Professor Jansen walked toward the board, examined it again, then turned to the other judges. "This isn't just original," he said. "It's dangerous. Because if it came from a student like him, it means the gatekeeping failed. And that, more than the math, was the real threat in the room." Then Whitlock, hands trembling now, announced, "Effective immediately, this solution is under investigation for potential plagiarism." The applause never came. Caleb had just demonstrated what multiple judges quietly admitted might be a world-first approach to an unsolvable problem. Yet the only response was a stiff retreat of authority. No congratulations. No photo ops. No medals. Only murmurs of protocol and investigation. As Caleb stepped down from the stage, the warmth that had begun to creep into the room froze. Professor Delcourt attempted to speak again, to request an independent review. But Whitlock waved her off and called an emergency closed-door judges meeting. Students were asked to leave the hall. Coaches were corralled into a side lounge. Caleb was escorted to a waiting area, with no explanation. That's when the shift began. They didn't shout. They didn't accuse him directly. Instead, the sabotage slithered into the system like smoke through vents. Quiet, pervasive, choking. The first sign was subtle. A competition assistant entered the waiting room, clipboard in hand, asking Caleb for his ID badge again. She scanned it, nodded awkwardly, and left. Moments later, another staff member arrived, this time asking for his solution sheet to verify handwriting. Caleb handed it over. The paper never came back. Then came the third staffer, a tall, bespectacled man, who claimed to be from the Academic Integrity Oversight Committee. He said there had been concerns raised about unusual similarities in Caleb's answer structure compared to certain graduate-level proofs circulating in research journals. Caleb asked to see the journals. The man declined. "We're simply cross-referencing at this point," he said, voice even. "Nothing formal yet." Caleb didn't panic. He had nothing to hide. But something in the man's expression made him uneasy, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. There was no curiosity, no sense of fairness, just an unspoken message: "You've gone too far." Meanwhile, behind the doors of the judge's chamber, Whitlock took center stage. He held a printed screenshot of Caleb's solution from the whiteboard and waved it like evidence at a crime scene. "This," he said, "is not a high schooler's work." Professor Delcourt shot back. "Because it's better than what you expected?" "Because it's suspicious," Whitlock countered. "Because it mirrors advanced theories currently under peer review at international symposiums." "But the method is original," Professor Ahmed argued. "None of the parallels are direct. In fact, most of us have never seen this exact reduction sequence before." Whitlock leaned in, voice low and sharp. "Which is exactly what makes it impossible." He turned toward the others. "Do we understand what happens if we legitimize this? A self-taught public school student, with no mentorship, no academic lineage, no institutional validation, outsmarting our top-tier programs? What precedent does that set?" Delcourt folded her arms. "The precedent of truth." But her voice was swallowed by silence. Most judges didn't meet her eyes. Then Whitlock said the phrase that sealed the shift. "This isn't his to solve." It wasn't said with anger. It was said with certainty. The entitlement of someone who believed the future of brilliance had a proper shape, a proper voice, a proper background. Caleb didn't match any of it. By the time Caleb was brought back into the hall, the energy had changed. The scoreboard, which previously held his score in the top tier, now showed a blank next to his name. His rank had vanished. Confused, Caleb approached an assistant. She avoided eye contact and said, "We're resolving a technical issue. Please wait." Miss Griggs found him minutes later, her face pale. She looked like she'd just come from a war room. "They took your papers," she whispered, "and your backpack. They said it was routine. I asked for clarification, and they told me to leave the judge's floor." "What did they say about my score?" Caleb asked, his voice calm. She hesitated. "They are re-evaluating everything. All your answers from all the rounds. They're saying your patterns are statistically inconsistent with your background." Caleb exhaled slowly, but his hands clenched. He wasn't new to this. The world didn't always yell at you when it came to keep you out. Sometimes it smiled. It filled out paperwork. It quoted policies. It audited brilliance until it disappeared. Griggs reached into her coat pocket and handed Caleb a phone. It was buzzing. It was a message from one of the junior judges, someone Caleb had barely spoken to. Just one word: "Run." Caleb stared at it. "Is this a threat?" Griggs asked, looking over his shoulder. No, Caleb murmured. It's a warning. The next hour unfolded like a controlled demolition. The competition's livestream, which had been broadcasting highlights of the event, including Caleb's solution, suddenly cut to a looping slideshow of sponsor logos. Online viewers began posting confused comments. Where's the solution replay? Did that student just disappear? Why is the board blank? Caleb's profile on the Olympiad website was deleted. Griggs demanded answers. She stormed to the front desk and asked for a supervisor. The staff shrugged. It's out of our hands, they said. The judges have the final word. Then, as quietly as it had begun, the final scores were posted, with Caleb's name completely absent, not even listed as a disqualified contestant, just erased, as if he had never been there. Whitlock made the final public announcement. After careful review, one of the entries has been withdrawn due to irregularities in submission and alignment with academic standards. We thank all our participants. No names, no explanation, just silence. But outside the venue, the air was no longer still.
Students had screenshots, clips, snippets of Caleb's work. A few had already posted on math forums. One video had nearly 1,000 shares in an hour. Comments were piling in. Who is this kid? Why are they hiding his work? This looks revolutionary.
Miss Griggs squeezed Caleb's shoulder.
We're not done, she said.
Caleb looked out the glass window at the parking lot beyond, and the world past it. No, he replied. They are. But just as they turned to leave, a second message buzzed onto Caleb's phone, from an anonymous number, with a screenshot attached. It showed his solution, posted on a foreign academic site, under someone else's name. The video began with a shaky frame, the lens slightly tilted, the lighting uneven, but the moment it captured would travel farther than anyone in that auditorium could have imagined. The clip, just under 6 minutes, showed Caleb Sanders standing at the Olympiad whiteboard, reconstructing a problem labeled unsolvable, with the ease of a composer revisiting an unfinished symphony. His thrift store blazer looked oversized under the harsh lights, his hands steady as he wrote. No narration, no cuts, just raw brilliance in motion. The student who had filmed it, a quiet kid named Alan from North Creek STEM, uploaded the video anonymously to a small math subreddit. The title read simply, "Kid from public school solves Olympiad problem that's been unsolved for 20 years, and they erased his name." Within 2 hours, the post had 1,000 upvotes. By morning it was on the front page. By noon, it was on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. The video was downloaded, reposted, translated, subtitled and stitched into commentary from math educators, influencers, and armchair theorists alike. Caleb didn't even know it had gone viral until the next day, when Ms. Griggs burst into his living room holding her phone like it was a winning lottery ticket. "Caleb," she called out, "you're trending. All of you, your whole damn brain is trending." At first he didn't believe her. Then he saw the comments. Thousands of them. This is insane. Why haven't we heard of this student before? Elegant and efficient, this kid just rewrote a major theorem. This boy's solution just cut through an entire semester's worth of theoretical math. Then the duet started. Educators breaking down Caleb's logic step by step. Many of them stumbling through the explanation but calling it a conceptual leap we haven't seen at high school level. Maybe not even at university level. There were breakdown videos in French, Korean, Arabic. An Indian math prodigy retweeted the clip, calling it a once-in-a-generation mind. A Nobel-winning economist reposted it with one line. Who is this genius? But with the praise came something else. Something darker. Within 24 hours a counter-narrative emerged, pushed by small but loud voices. A clip of Whitlock, from a local Chicago news interview, began to circulate. In the interview, Whitlock, still calm, still calculated, didn't mention Caleb by name, but referred to an incident involving academic dishonesty at the Olympiad. When pressed, he elaborated. Let's just say some students today are using sophisticated tools, even AI, to mimic work that seems original. It's not always easy to verify if that work truly came from their mind. The implication was unmistakable. Caleb's name didn't need to be spoken. Within hours, right-wing Twitter pundits picked up the clip. Blogs reposted it. Hashtags began to trend.
Algorithm kid.
Too good to be true. Olympiad scam. They called his work AI-generated, scripted, reverse-engineered. They questioned his accent, his clothes, his school. They weaponized doubt, as only the internet can. One influencer sneered on camera. You expect me to believe a kid with that haircut from that school solved a problem? Experts couldn't. The racism was quiet at first, but it metastasized fast. Anonymous accounts posted side-by-side comparisons of Caleb and white Olympiad contestants. Captioned, "One of these belongs. The other hacked the system." Someone even edited the video to make it seem like Caleb had paused mid-solution to look up something on his phone, a moment that never happened. But the edit went viral anyway. Caleb watched all of it unfold, with the stillness of someone used to disbelief. But Miss Griggs noticed the way his foot tapped restlessly under the table, the way he stopped doodling in his notebook, the way he hesitated before opening his laptop. "It's not about them believing me," Caleb said finally. "It's about them needing me not to be real." The school board called a closed-door emergency hearing. It wasn't public, but word leaked fast. Officially, they were reviewing Caleb's academic record, in light of new developments. Unofficially, they were covering themselves. Whitlock had called the superintendent personally, citing serious concerns about plagiarism and system exploitation. Caleb's counselor, who had never once offered him more than a passing "you're doing well," now left 3 voicemails in one day, not to offer help, but to ask if he'd spoken to media outlets. "We're trying to manage the situation." The school district sent out a bland statement about academic integrity and committed investigation, without once naming Caleb. It was as if he had become radioactive, too loud to ignore, too black to celebrate. And then as Caleb sat by the window of Miss Griggs's living room, watching the sun retreat behind gray Chicago clouds, the call came. Unknown number. Swiss country code. Miss Griggs answered first, her face wary. "Hello?" A pause. She handed the phone to Caleb. "They're asking for you." He took it, cautiously. "Hello?" A precise voice with a French-Swiss accent responded. "Mr. Sanders, this is Dr. Émile Rousseau, from the International Mathematics Prize Committee. We saw your solution." Caleb blinked. "You saw it?" "We studied it," Rousseau said. 3 members of our board reviewed the methodology this morning. We believe what you've presented is not only original, but a leap in how we understand modular convergence." Caleb didn't respond. Dr. Rousseau continued. "This year the AMP is inviting exceptional young minds to present live in Geneva. We would be honored if you would allow us to verify and publish your work. Under your name." Caleb's voice caught. "They're saying it's not mine, that it's AI or copied." There was a pause on the other end. Then Rousseau replied, softly but firmly, "Genius is often mistaken for theft when it comes from unexpected places. But the math is pure. It speaks for itself." Another pause. "You have a passport?" Caleb looked at Ms. Griggs, who was already pulling a file from her drawer. "Yes," he said. "I do." "Good. Then come to Geneva," Rousseau said. "Let us do what the others wouldn't. Listen." The call ended. Caleb stared at the phone for a long time. For once his thoughts weren't racing. They were quiet.
Griggs smiled gently. "Told you. They can't erase the truth forever."
But even as she spoke, Caleb's inbox pinged again. This time from an unfamiliar address. Subject, urgent, legal claim of prior work. Attached was a scanned PDF, an academic paper, recently posted to a small international archive. The title, An Innovative Framework for Divergent Series Reversal. The author, P. Whitlock. And inside the abstract, line for line, was Caleb's solution. Word for word, without his name. The boarding pass felt like paper-thin proof of existence. Caleb Sanders clutched it with fingers that had stopped trusting reality. The ink was barely dry, and already customs agents had flagged his name. He stood in a long line at Chicago O'Hare, a battered duffel bag slung over one shoulder, Ms. Griggs beside him, scanning documents with the focus of a public defender. "I'm sorry, but we need additional verification," said the agent, tone flat. Caleb offered the invitation letter again, signed by Dr. Émile Rousseau, on official International Mathematics Prize Committee letterhead. "I'm not attending," Caleb said quietly. "I was invited to present." But logic, he was learning, didn't always work outside of equations. The agent flipped through his passport again, squinting at the travel history. One entry, a middle school science trip to D.C. That was it. Nothing in his record screamed danger. Just unfamiliarity. Unpredictability. That was enough. After 20 tense minutes, Ms. Griggs pulled up a phone call, with Rousseau himself, live. Only then did they clear Caleb to board. He wasn't late, but he wasn't early either. The flight to Geneva was overnight, long and pressurized. Caleb didn't sleep. He stared out the window, watching clouds stretch like unmarked paper. Somewhere below, equations whispered, but above all, a question repeated in his head. What happens if they steal it again? By the time he landed, the symposium was already in motion. The International Mathematics Prize Conference was a sleek, glittering academic affair held at the Geneva Science Pavilion. There were press booths, LED screens, translator headsets, and glass doors that opened without being touched. Professors from every continent wore suits with embedded QR codes linking to their research. Students from elite institutions roamed like celebrities. Caleb, in his pressed but clearly reworn blazer, stood out. Again, at the registration desk, the volunteer frowned. Your name isn't listed in the presentation queue. Caleb handed her the letter. I was invited directly by Dr. Rousseau. I have 10 minutes. The volunteer read it. Then again, then typed furiously into the system. I don't see it logged, she said. You'll have to wait. He waited. Hours passed. Panels rolled by. Talks about quantum chaos and post-statistical learning filled the auditorium. Caleb sat quietly in the corner near the emergency exit. Again, the seat nearest the edge. The irony wasn't lost on him. At 4:27 p.m., the crowd stirred as Professor Veer Rajan entered the hall, a world-renowned Indian mathematician, known for revolutionizing algebraic topology. His presence alone shifted attention. Students rose. Professors whispered. Cameras clicked. He scanned the room and paused when his eyes fell on Caleb. He walked straight to him. You're the student from Chicago, Rajan said, his tone calm but urgent. The convergence solution, it was yours? Caleb nodded. Yes, sir. I read your steps. I verified it. This method has implications far beyond competition math. Caleb remained still. I'm not on the agenda, he said. They erased it. Rajan straightened. Then we make room. He turned to the organizers, and within minutes wielded the authority of legacy to open a 10-minute window in the schedule. During the final hour, just before the closing address, some grumbled. Others watched with quiet curiosity. When Caleb was called to the stage, there were no applause, no music, just confusion. Who was this? Why him? He walked slowly to the front, unaccompanied, as screens reset and lights adjusted to follow his pace. The moderator announced, Caleb Sanders, independent researcher, presenting a novel approach to divergent convergence modeling. No titles, no institution, just his name, and the question mark that now hung beside it. Caleb's hands didn't shake. He clicked the remote. The screen lit up with his opening slide, a cleaned-up rendering of the equation Whitlock had once erased. This method, Caleb began, was never meant to be published. I started it while working the closing shift at a grocery store. The crowd stirred. He continued, walking them through the thought process, not just the logic, but the instincts, the detours. The moments where he nearly gave up, then saw something new. He didn't use technical jargon, unless he had to. He used metaphors, like folding a map until two cities touch. He paused for translation, adjusted for pace, and looked every professor in the eye. The math was no longer an equation. It was a story. And by the time he reached the end, where the identity folded cleanly into itself, the room had stopped breathing. Silent, then whispering. Then, rapid whispers. One professor in the third row stood. Another pulled out his laptop, frantically copying the method. In the back, a journalist scribbled a note that would later become the headline, Brilliance with no country of origin. Caleb clicked to his final slide. No grand ending. Just 4 words. It was always mine. He stepped back. Before anyone could respond, the doors opened, and in walked Preston Whitlock. Not in a judge's suit, but in a tailored academic jacket, flanked by 2 European scholars. He walked with purpose. He carried a black binder. He went straight to the stage. The audience stiffened. Caleb didn't move. Whitlock stood at the mic and cleared his throat. I'd like to speak, he said. This work, this specific method, bears a striking resemblance to a paper I submitted 2 weeks ago under review with the Global Mathematical Journal. I'd like the committee to consider the possibility of intellectual overlap. The silence was now sharper. Caleb turned. His face betrayed nothing. But before he could speak, before anyone else could, a tall, elderly man near the center of the auditorium slowly rose to his feet. Dr. Haruto Kanda, mathematician, Nobel laureate, architect of modern chaos theory. He held no notes, just a pen. I have reviewed both works, he said, voice calm. deliberate. All heads turned. Dr. Whitlock's submission was uploaded after the Olympiad, and the proof structure, while superficially similar, lacks the original behavioral mapping sequence that this young man has just demonstrated. Whitlock stiffened. This, Conda said, pointing to Caleb, is not overlap. It is theft. Gasps. The moderator stumbled over words. Conda stepped down toward the stage. He faced Caleb directly. You may not have an institution, he said, but what you have cannot be faked. You've done something even we didn't think was possible. He turned back to the audience. This, he said, is the future of mathematics. And before Caleb could respond, a woman burst into the room, a Geneva legal official, holding a cease and desist order, filed by Whitlock against Caleb, for fraudulent representation of authorship. The Geneva Symposium ended not with applause, but with a war. Dr. Haruto Konda's public declaration had drawn a line in the sand. Caleb Sanders, the anonymous student from a public school in Chicago, had just been named the author of a mathematical breakthrough. But the moment of vindication was bulldozed by Whitlock's legal ambush. A cease and desist order drafted with calculated speed, designed not to win but to confuse, to cast doubt, and to Geneva's legal board refused to enforce it without review. The prize committee postponed the official publication pending investigation. Caleb's 10-minute talk, initially scheduled to be a footnote, became headline news. Europe lit up. Le Monde. American student outsmarts system that tried to silence him. Der Spiegel. The boy who solved the impossible, then got erased. Al Jazeera. When brilliance is black. Caleb Sanders and the war on talent. But in the US the response was quieter, calculatedly so. Major outlets carried brief headlines. Controversy at Geneva. Math contest under review. No names. No images. The focus wasn't on Caleb's brilliance. It was on investigative proceedings, potential academic misconduct, and disputed authorship claims. When Caleb landed back in Chicago, customs waved him through, but the stares he received were sharp, suspicious. At baggage claim, a woman stared too long. A man whispered into his phone and snapped a photo. A security guard trailed him out of the terminal. No welcome banners, no school posters, just whined in silence. Miss Griggs drove him home, her grip on the wheel tighter than usual.
They're going to pretend you didn't happen, she said.
Caleb didn't respond. He just looked out the window. By the time he got home, the school district had sent an email to all parents. The district is aware of recent news coverage. While we support student exploration, we are committed to maintaining academic integrity and due process. Caleb's name wasn't mentioned. 2 days later, the school board formally declined to reinstate his Olympiad scores. The decision, they said, was final. The justification? Procedural anomalies.
Mrs. Griggs demanded to speak at the board meeting. They denied her request.
She showed up anyway. They cut her mic after 30 seconds. 2 days later, she was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Caleb found out on a Monday morning. By then, the campus hallways were whispering again. Teachers avoided eye contact. Students glanced at him like he was radioactive. The silence this time wasn't ignorance. It was fear. He checked his email. Nothing from his principal. Nothing from the district. But 26 invitations from universities across Europe and Asia. Cambridge, ETH Zurich, IIT Delhi, Kyoto University. They all wanted him to speak. Harvard didn't. Yale didn't. MIT sent a form letter. The University of Chicago invited him to visit, but not to present. Back home, his mailbox filled with letters from strangers. Some praised him, some warned him. One anonymous envelope contained a single printed line. We know you didn't do it alone. Another read. Your coach is using you. The paranoia was spreading. Manufactured doubt. Seeded and fertilized by Whitlock's subtle campaign. He had declined every major interview, but his fingerprints were on every whisper. Podcasts, think pieces, tweets from legacy professors, questioning the unverifiable nature of Caleb's background. They're trying to drown the truth in footnotes, Griggs said, pacing her kitchen. Caleb sat quietly, watching her. He'd never seen her this angry. She looked at him. You know what they're afraid of? What? You didn't just solve the problem. You cracked their control over the rules. Caleb rubbed his temple. What if it doesn't matter? What if they win anyway? She placed her hand flat on the table. Then you make sure people know they did. A week passed, then another. Caleb remained out of school, technically enrolled, but frozen out. No classes, No counselor meetings, no updates on his record. The Geneva Committee finally published an interim report. Caleb's method was original, mathematically sound, and had no overlap with any existing published works. His authorship was affirmed. But still, the American institutions said nothing. Until a journalist named Diana Sloan showed up at Caleb's door. She didn't look like the others. No press badge, no camera crew, just a plain coat, a notebook, and a tone that suggested she'd seen 100 stories just like his, and wasn't about to let this one be buried. "I want to put you on national television," she said. "Not just a segment, a full sit-down." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Why now?" "Because your silence is helping them," she replied. "And because they don't think you'll say yes." Griggs folded her arms. "What's the angle?" Sloan didn't flinch. "Truth. I'll ask hard questions. I won't softball you. But I'll give you the space to speak. Unedited." Caleb looked down. "You sure they'll air it?" "They won't stop me," Sloan said. "And if they try, I'll leak it myself." The risk was enormous. Going public meant scrutiny, exposure. It meant letting America decide what version of him they wanted to believe. It meant standing alone. Again. That night, Caleb sat at his desk, staring at the Geneva letter again, the one that declared his method a new international benchmark in modular convergence. The weight of those words didn't feel like a trophy. It felt like a target. Griggs knocked gently on the door. "You don't have to do this," she said. Caleb looked up. "I already did," he replied. She smiled faintly. "Good. Because I just got an email." He raised an eyebrow. "They fired me," she said. Caleb's face fell. "I'm sorry." "No," she said, voice steady. "Don't be. I'd do it again. 1,000 times." He nodded. They sat in silence. The next morning, Sloan arrived with a camera crew. The interview was filmed in Caleb's living room. No filters, no green screens, just his voice, the truth, and a nation watching. "I wasn't supposed to win," Caleb said into the camera. "Not the way they wanted me to. I was supposed to prove what they already believed, that I didn't belong." He paused. "But I didn't win by their rules. I won by solving something they said couldn't be solved. And the moment I did, they erased me." Sloan leaned forward. "What do you want people to take from this?" Caleb looked directly at the lens. "That genius isn't a pedigree. It's not a name, a prep school, or a country club resume. Sometimes it's a kid with a cracked calculator and no one in his corner." He didn't cry. He didn't yell. But the world heard him. Within 24 hours, the interview had 2 million views. Within 48, 10 million. Hashtags trended. Protests formed outside his school board building. Students walked out. Teachers began posting their own stories. Of racial profiling, gifted students overlooked, doors closed before they even opened. The Geneva Prize Committee moved to formally recognize Caleb as an independent scholar, a category previously reserved only for university fellows. But then, just as the tide began to turn, Sloan called Caleb, in the middle of the night, breathless, shaking. "They're trying to block the broadcast replay. Someone hacked the station servers. Your full interview, it's gone." The morning after Caleb's interview aired, he woke to 100 missed calls, 4 dead phone batteries, and a sidewalk full of strangers standing outside his home. Some held signs, "We believe Caleb." Others held different ones. "He's making it about race." One man shouted into a megaphone, "Where's the proof?" News vans parked bumper to bumper. A drone hovered. Ms. Griggs had to push her way through a crowd just to reach the front door. Caleb opened it slowly. His face blank, his voice hoarse. "Don't go online today," she said, brushing past him. "Don't read the threads. Not yet." He nodded. He didn't ask for details. He already knew. The interview had ignited something far bigger than truth. In the viral clip, now reposted by every major platform, Caleb's face filled the screen, lit only by a single lamp. His voice never cracked. He didn't yell, he didn't curse, but his words hit like a slow, building avalanche. "I didn't need their approval to be right," he had said, "but I needed their approval to be heard. And that's the difference between brilliance and recognition in this country." Then came the part no one had expected. When he named names, he said them clearly. Dr. Preston Whitlock, James Baldwin High School, the Olympiad Committee, the school district's assistant superintendent who signed off on his score being nullified. He didn't accuse, he described. Every moment, every dismissal, every policy that was written in neutral language but enforced with bias. every time someone claimed objectivity while handing him a broom instead of a book. The interview cracked the country in half. Some called him the math Malcolm X. Others branded him a divisive fraud. One news anchor said, "This is a young man weaponizing victimhood." Another said, "He's the Rosa Parks of the math world." It wasn't about math anymore. It was about who had the right to be right. Whitlock moved quickly. Within 24 hours, his legal team filed a defamation lawsuit, citing irreparable damage to reputation and fabricated claims of systemic discrimination. Whitlock released a statement. "I have dedicated my life to academic rigor and integrity. To see it attacked so publicly, with such reckless accusation, is both hurtful and defamatory." He went on to say Caleb's solution was still under investigation for potential algorithmic manipulation, and that personal attacks masked as social commentary had no place in academic discourse. But public records began surfacing, showing Whitlock's long pattern of unusual grading discrepancies for Black and brown students. One mother posted a scanned letter. Her son had been expelled for academic dishonesty the day after scoring the highest mark in Whitlock's class. Another posted screenshots of emails where Whitlock had refused to write a recommendation for a student who hadn't yet demonstrated the right attitude. Still, the damage to Caleb was done. His inbox flooded. Some emails were offers, book deals, interviews, TED Talk invitations. Others were threats. Graphic. Anonymous. "I hope you fail. Forever. Take your gift back to the projects. Don't speak for all of us." Caleb closed his laptop. He didn't eat that day. Miss Griggs sat beside him. Quiet. Watching. She knew the look, the stillness that came before collapse. "They're trying to make you hate yourself," she said. "I don't hate me," Caleb whispered. She looked at him. "I just hate that I'm not surprised." That night, they heard something at the door. A knock, soft but intentional. Miss Griggs opened it.
No one was there.
Just a sealed manila envelope, resting on the mat. No return address. Only Caleb's name written in black ink, all caps. He picked it up, brought it inside, peeled it open slowly, like it might explode. Inside was a handwritten letter. No salutation. Just this. "I watched what you said. Every word. I was once where you are now. My name is Tyson Ward. In 2009, I was a student under Whitlock at Hanover Prep. He told me I was too emotional to succeed in STEM. Then he accused me of plagiarizing a paper I'd written about number theory, and expelled me 2 weeks before graduation. He published that same paper 6 months later, under his name. No one believed me. I thought I was crazy, but then I saw you, and I remembered. I'm not crazy. I still have the original files, the emails, all of it. If you're ready to end him, really end him, call me. No press, no noise, just justice." At the bottom was a burner phone number. Caleb's hand shook. Miss Griggs leaned in. "Tyson Ward, that name sounds familiar." Caleb Googled him. The top result, former Hanover Prep student expelled for academic dishonesty in Next result, Whitlock's award-winning paper on number theory, a retrospective. And in the footnotes of that paper, no mention of any co-authors. No acknowledgments. Just Whitlock. Caleb sat back in his chair, heart pounding. This wasn't just about him anymore.
Whitlock had a pattern.
A history. A system. And Tyson Ward was the living proof. Ms. Griggs looked at him. "So what now?" Caleb stared at the number. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Diana Sloan. Her voice was urgent. "Caleb, listen. Whitlock just went live on national television. He's spinning everything, calling you mentally unstable. He says the interview was edited to manipulate public sympathy. He's demanding a federal investigation." Caleb's jaw clenched. "Diana," he said. "What?" "I need your help." "With what?" "I'm going to leak something. But not to you, not to the media, to everyone." There was a pause on the line. "You're sure?" Sloan asked. "This could break you." Caleb's voice was steady now. "If it breaks me, I was never free." That night, Caleb uploaded the entire archive Tyson had sent him, emails, documents, early drafts, to a public decentralized server, and within minutes a chilling PDF began circulating titled, "The Whitlock File: 15 Years of Intellectual Theft." The file spread like a virus no firewall could contain. The Whitlock File: 15 Years of Intellectual Theft, 86 pages long, time-stamped, cross-referenced, digitally signed, hit the internet at 3:12 a.m. By 3:27, it was being live-tweeted by legal scholars. By 4:02 it was front page on Reddit. By 5:30, it crashed the academic servers of Hanover Prep and 3 affiliated competition platforms. Every file was authenticated, every source verified, and every paragraph told the same story, over and over again. Whitlock had a system. Emails showed him intercepting high-performing assignments from students of color and rerouting them to review folders. Never returned. Rewritten segments from those same assignments appeared, months later in academic conference papers under his authorship. Names were scrubbed, credits omitted. The language used in the emails was cold, clinical, unverified originality, cultural performance inflation, no institutional pedigree, no legitimacy. Whitlock hadn't just plagiarized. He'd done it strategically, targeting the brilliant students whose stories wouldn't be believed. The PDF also contained internal memos from Hanover's administration, discussing reputation management, warning Whitlock about pushing too many cases to expulsion in one demographic. He hadn't stopped. They hadn't stopped him. And now, with the files public, they couldn't deny it any longer. Tyson Ward, now living under a different name, working a night job at a data firm, confirmed everything on a live stream with Diana Sloan. He showed early drafts, dated notes, voicemails Whitlock had left him in 2009, gaslighting him into silence.
I thought it was just me, Tyson said, blinking away tears. But Caleb made me realize we were patterned out of the system.
The phrase caught fire. Patterned out trended worldwide within hours. Caleb watched from the couch in his living room, legs pulled up to his chest, the glow of the laptop flickering against his face. He hadn't spoken much since the file went public. Griggs hovered nearby, phone in one hand, fielding media requests, security offers, legal queries. You just pulled down an institution, she whispered. No, Caleb replied. I pulled back the curtain. They're still standing, but not for long. Because the Whitlock story wasn't staying a story. It was becoming a signal. Within days, former students began coming forward from other regions, testifying under burner accounts, video call interviews, pseudonyms, sharing eerily similar experiences. A math prodigy in Atlanta, who had her work downgraded for formatting errors and watched her teacher publish a similar paper 2 years later. A Native American student in New Mexico, whose algorithm was rejected for lack of citations, despite being completely original, only to see it win a regional award under someone else's name. A Nigerian-American high school senior in Michigan, who was disqualified mid-competition after a judge said, "It's too polished for your age." Caleb had never met them, but he'd been them, and now their stories were forming the foundation of something bigger. Lawyers mobilized. Civil rights firms launched an exploratory inquiry. An independent ethics panel from the Geneva Symposium opened a joint task force. A class action lawsuit was formed within a week. Sanders' Fictional Academic Governance Council, with Caleb listed not as plaintiff, but as precedent. Still, institutions hesitated. Hanover Prep released a cold statement. We are reviewing the contents of the leaked documents and reaffirm our commitment to academic integrity. The Olympiad Committee refused to comment, citing ongoing investigations. Caleb had become a symbol, but also a target. News cycles turned on him. A popular morning host sneered into the camera. Is he really the next Einstein, or just the next cancel culture darling? A syndicated columnist wrote, "What happens when we let teenagers decide the future of science?" Anonymous Twitter accounts flooded every post about Caleb with doctored screenshots and false accusations, claiming he doctored his solution, that the files were fabricated, that Tyson Ward was a paid actor. Caleb began receiving death threats. Griggs had to install a home security system. Sloan Station was hacked. Again. But protesters pushed back harder. They marched outside Hanover Prep with signs reading, "Brilliance is not a crime." They surrounded the Olympiad Committee's DC office with banners, "Investigate the investigators." One video showed a black girl in a school uniform holding a sign, "I don't want to be next." Still, Whitlock had not been formally fired, only placed on leave. Caleb sat at his kitchen table, staring at a notification from his school district, an invitation to return.
No apology, no reinstated scores, just, you may resume your studies at your discretion.
He laughed, bitterly. "They're offering me a seat at a table I built," he said. Griggs said nothing. She slid a folder across the table. "What's this?" he asked. "The lawsuit papers," she said. "You're not named as plaintiff. You're being protected, but they want you to read the depositions." Caleb opened it. The first was from a girl named Jasmine Duval. expelled in 2012 under Whitlock. She had been in honors calculus. Her record was spotless. The file included an internal note from Whitlock, calling her a cultural liability with a tendency toward dramatization. Caleb shut the folder. They called her a liability because she existed. Griggs nodded. They're scared, she said. But they're not gone. At that moment, Caleb's phone buzzed. An email. Subject line. Confidential. Internal review communications. Leaked. Sender. Anonymous whistle. He opened it.
Inside, a zip file.
He unzipped it slowly. Inside the folder were dozens of screenshots, dated 3 months before the Olympiad. They were internal communications from the Olympiad committee. In them, judges exchanged emails and messages using institutional accounts. One line from a senior judge read, "Watch out for that Baldwin kid. Public school outlier. Possible media bait." Another, "Keep his scores neutral, unless verified by faculty pedigree." Another still, "Whitlock says he's unstable. Flag for security if needed." And the final one, dated 2 days before the competition began. "If he solves the Goldstein problem, proceed with procedural hold. Not credible without documentation. Remember, optics matter." Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. They hadn't just doubted him. They'd anticipated him and planned for erasure. This wasn't sabotage born out of surprise. It was a protocol. They'd seen his name and immediately written a script for his failure. Griggs read over his shoulder. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They were going to erase you, no matter what." Caleb looked up. "Then it's not just about Whitlock." "No," she said. "It never was." And then came the final file. A list of flagged students from across the country, with Caleb's name circled in red and a handwritten note next to it. "Not one of us." The chat logs hit like a second explosion. If the Whitlock file was the match, this was the firestorm. Hundreds of screenshots. Messages sent through Olympiad committee group chats and internal Slack channels. Every log time-stamped, each thread more damning than the last. The tone was smug, offhand, almost playful. One judge joked, "Let's hope the Baldwin kid knows polynomials from potatoes." Another, "If he shows up in that same funeral jacket, I swear I'm docking 10 points for fashion alone." Then came the one no one could dismiss. "Give him the Goldstein problem. I want to see him panic on camera. No math, no evaluation, just cruelty, calculated and deliberate." But the most chilling message came from Whitlock himself. "If he cracks it, I'll eat my diploma. But let's prep a hold policy just in case. Last thing we need is another social media martyr." Those words weren't a defense. They were a blueprint. And for 48 hours, it looked like the logs would vanish without trace. The committee, under pressure, began an internal inquiry. The public statement was brief. "Documents under review. We remain committed to fairness." Then the portal housing the chat logs went dark. Passwords changed. Files scrubbed. It was over. Until an intern, barely old enough to rent a car, stepped in. Her name was Ava Lewis, a summer fellow from Howard University. She had saved the logs. All of them. She uploaded them to a decentralized public archive, adding one note: "If the truth matters, don't let them bury it." The public backlash reignited. Newsrooms scrambled. Students flooded message boards. Professors penned open letters. For the first time, calls for disbanding the entire Olympiad board gained traction. But it was already too late in one critical way. The prize committee in Geneva had issued an ultimatum. They would be voting to either nullify or affirm Caleb's recognition as the innovator behind the new convergence model, based on their standing criteria. The vote would happen in 4 days. Geneva didn't operate on outrage. They needed documentation, iron-proof evidence, something undeniable. Not emotional, not viral, which Caleb didn't have. Not yet. He sat in the back of Miss Griggs's dusty classroom, now empty. Her final act of rebellion was unlocking the doors after being suspended. The chalkboards were clean. The clock ticked like a countdown. Caleb rubbed his temples. "They'll find a way to say it's not enough," he whispered. "They'll make it look technical." Griggs pulled a small metal tin from her bag and placed it on the desk. Caleb looked up. "What's that?" "A mess," she said. Inside, nestled beneath an old lanyard and 2 paper clips, was a scratched red flash drive. "I found it cleaning out my desk. Thought I lost it months ago." Caleb frowned. "What's on it?" Griggs hesitated. "Something I recorded during the Olympiad," she said. "I didn't mean to. I had my recorder running during final rounds for notes." He plugged it into his laptop. A folder opened. Only one file. Audio only final round. He pressed play. The static crackled for a second. Then voices. Caleb's voice, faint, narrating parts of his process at the board. Then, another voice. Closer. Whispered. Familiar. Whitlock. Focus on this part. The identity transformation. Show confidence, but not arrogance. The audience eats up modesty. Silence. Then a younger male voice. Higher pitched, nervous. Okay, but should I change the third line? What if someone else? No one else is getting this. Trust me. And if anyone tries to, we'll deal with it. Caleb's stomach dropped. He rewound. Listened again. Whitlock had been coaching another student during Caleb's round. On the same problem. Caleb stood. He gave it to him. The same method. Griggs nodded. But the kid couldn't execute it. I remember. He froze. He didn't even attempt the board. Caleb stared at the screen. That means Whitlock knew how the problem worked before I solved it in public. Griggs was already dialing Sloan. We don't send this to the press, she said. We send it to Geneva. Direct. Caleb stared at the waveform pulsing on the screen. This wasn't just proof of sabotage. It was proof of conspiracy. That night, Caleb sat on his porch. His inbox pinged again. Urgent. Preliminary vote results. Delayed 48 hours pending new evidence review. He exhaled. Still time. 2 more days. He received an anonymous tip shortly after midnight. Check archive line 37. There's more. He did. And what he found made his hands shake. Line 3117. A single message from Whitlock to 2 judges. Backup solution exists. I gave it to Brendan. If the Sanders kid gets close, claim plagiarism from peer leak. Covers us all. Griggs stared at it with wide eyes. He planted the solution, so he could say you copied him. Caleb swallowed hard.
They always had the story ready, he whispered.
Now he had to break it. He drafted a letter to the Geneva Committee. Clear, calm, full citations, attached files, dates, comparisons, the audio clip, the log entry, a side-by-side of his work in the planted solution, highlighting differences, improvements, and the timestamps that proved authorship. He ended the letter with one line. I didn't just solve the problem. I solved the playbook. Griggs reviewed it. Wordlessly. Then she nodded. This is your closing argument, she said. He hit send. The timer was ticking. And still, Caleb couldn't sleep. He kept hearing that whisper. If he solves it, proceed with procedural hold. He wasn't paranoid. They had planned this, and now they had one last move. The next morning, Caleb received a legal notice. The Geneva Committee was requesting live testimony, and Whitlock would be allowed to cross-examine him. The Geneva Committee didn't convene in a courtroom. It didn't need to. The hearing room, sleek and glass-walled, was perched above Lake Geneva, with snow-capped mountains reflected in the windows. It was meant to feel serene, neutral, above the world's noise. But inside, tension hung in the air like static electricity. 5 panelists sat at the front, 2 Nobel laureates, 1 mathematician emeritus, 1 ethics chair, and the president of the International Mathematics Prize Committee. Each had a binder, each had read the documents. Caleb Sanders entered alone. No lawyer, no entourage, just a worn backpack slung over one shoulder, and his now famous cracked calculator in his hand. Not as a prop, but because he still used it. The hearing was being live-streamed to over 1.2 million viewers. Reporters had been granted limited access. Comment threads across platforms ran in real time, dissecting his body language, his tone, his word choice. Whitlock entered 10 minutes later. He wore a tailored 3-piece suit, his hair slicked back, the corners of his mouth pulled into what might have once been a smile. He sat beside his legal counsel but requested to speak for himself. The room agreed. Caleb was asked to begin. He stood. No theatrics. No pause for effect. My name is Caleb Sanders. I'm 17 years old. I attend James Baldwin High School in Chicago. I was accused of plagiarizing my own solution because I didn't look like someone expected to have one. A B. Then he clicked to his first slide, a side-by-side timeline. On the left, his handwritten notes, time-stamped from months before the Olympiad. On the right, Whitlock's student Brendan's test sheet, which Caleb's audio file proved had been coached. I didn't know there was a setup, Caleb said. I just knew I wasn't supposed to be the one who solved it. He played the audio. The room didn't move. Then came the message logs.
Then the flagged student list.
Then, the manipulated scorecard from the Olympiad. Every claim verified. every time stamped in By the end, one of the panelists quietly removed her glasses and set them on the table, a gesture of wordless resignation. When Caleb finished, he didn't sit down immediately. He looked directly at the panel. My work wasn't just erased. It was pre-erased. There was a backup plan before I even touched the board. Then he sat. A moment passed. Then they turned to Whitlock. He stood slowly, like a man cornered but trying to maintain posture. I want to be clear, he began. This isn't about race. It's about academic integrity. It's about skepticism. Healthy skepticism. He paused. I've been a gatekeeper because the gates need keeping. Every year, hundreds of students claim brilliance. Very few earn it. We can't let viral clips override rigor. The panel didn't respond. He continued. I've been called a thief, a racist, a fraud, all for asking questions. Is that not reverse discrimination? Now the chat feeds exploded. Thousands of messages flooded in. Reverse racism doesn't erase theft. The gates didn't need keeping. They needed unlocking. So the one time he got caught, it's suddenly about him? Whitlock gestured to Caleb's materials. This student has become a media darling. But let's remember, genius requires not just vision, but humility. Is it humble to accuse the entire system? Caleb didn't flinch. He had heard worse. In quieter rooms, from people who smiled while they said it. The panel asked no questions. Instead, one by one, they requested confirmation from their own technical experts. Yes, the solution is original. Yes, the timestamps are verifiable. Yes, the coaching audio is authentic. Yes, the chat logs were real.
No, there is no evidence of algorithmic assistance or AI-generated manipulation.
Then the chairwoman spoke. Mr. Whitlock, it is the opinion of this committee that your conduct violated the ethical guidelines of this institution, the Olympiad, and the principles of academic impartiality. Gasps echoed in live streams. A journalist in London tweeted, he's going down, finally. But Caleb didn't move. No smirk, no headshake, no moment of glory. Whitlock stood, face flushed. I gave 30 years to this field. Caleb looked up, and for the first time he spoke not to the committee, but to Whitlock. I know, he said. That's why this hurts more. The room held its breath. I wasn't the first kid you tried to erase, Caleb continued. And I wasn't the last, but I might be the first who had the receipts. He stood. I came here to tell the truth, not to destroy you. Whitlock narrowed his eyes. You already have. Caleb shook his head. No, he said. Because I forgive you. Silence. Total. Not even the keys of live tweeters clacked. Caleb continued, voice steady but soft. You don't get to keep me in the story of your fall. This was never about revenge. It was about math. About truth. About making sure the next kid doesn't walk into that room already considered guilty. Even the panelists looked shaken. Caleb turned to the audience. To anyone watching, especially students who've been told they're too loud, too different, too poor, too black to belong, this moment is yours. And it doesn't need permission. Then he walked off the stage.
Leave.
Unfiltered, unbought. Within an hour, Harvard cut all ties with Whitlock. Hanover Prep suspended him, pending further legal action. A dozen universities released joint statements denouncing academic gatekeeping disguised as rigor. Whitlock's publisher withdrew his upcoming textbook. A faculty vote to revoke his tenure was scheduled within 72 hours. And yet Caleb didn't celebrate. He returned to Chicago quietly. No parades, no victory tour. Just the long silence of a truth finally spoken. But the world wasn't done with him yet. That night, Caleb received a letter from the White House, inviting him to present his method before the National Science Advisory Council, and offering him a spot on a panel that hadn't had a black member in over a decade. The acceptance letters came in thick envelopes, padded with glossy brochures and hand-signed notes from deans. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT. Some included scholarships. Others, private invitations to research labs and thought leadership forums. A few went further, offering Caleb the chance to redefine the future of mathematical innovation, packaged in fonts that had never once been used to recruit kids from James Baldwin High. Caleb read every word, then quietly stacked the letters, tied them with a rubber band, and placed them in the back of his closet. He wasn't going. He'd seen enough of institutions. What he wanted couldn't be found in oak-paneled lecture halls or tenured applause. He wanted something harder, more permanent, something no one could steal. So Caleb rented out the old post office near the west side of Chicago, A squat brick building tagged with graffiti and long forgotten by the city's redevelopment plans. The windows were cracked, the floors warped, the plumbing uncertain, but to Caleb it looked like possibility. With the help of a small donation from a private foundation, no strings attached, and a GoFundMe campaign launched quietly by Diana Sloan, he transformed the space into a math and logic center for underserved students. He called it the Unlocked Room. There were no entrance exams, no uniforms, no ranking systems, just desks, whiteboards, second-hand laptops, and ideas. Caleb didn't teach math like other places did. He didn't hand out formulas or test prep. He told stories. He'd start a lesson with a riddle, or a problem disguised as a joke, or a drawing of a broken machine, and a single question: how would you fix this? Then he'd wait, sometimes minutes, sometimes half the class period, until the room cracked. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. His goal wasn't to create prodigies, it was to rebuild confidence in kids who had been told their thoughts didn't matter. In the first year, 17 students enrolled. By the second year, it was, and in the third year, 2 unexpected volunteers showed up. Both were former students of Whitlock. One had quit math entirely after being accused of plagiarizing tone in an exam essay. The other had transferred schools after a counselor suggested a creative path might be more appropriate. They sat at the back of Caleb's class for the first 2 sessions, silent, guarded. Then one of them, Taryn, asked, "What if we just don't get it?" Caleb smiled. "Then it's my fault, not yours." That line changed everything. By the 4th year, local news stations had discovered the camp. They called it an underground math revolution. One headline read, "From Cancelled to Catalyst: How Caleb Sanders is Rebuilding Education from Below." But Caleb never answered their calls. He wasn't interested in redemption stories that required villains to feel complete. The media had moved on anyway. A few think pieces resurfaced every Black History Month. One documentary aired on an independent network. And yes, his method was added to some college textbooks. A sidebar in a calculus guide, a case study in an education journal, a footnote in a theory course at Cambridge. But the real legacy wasn't written. It sat at plastic desks every Tuesday and Thursday, wearing oversized hoodies and chewing pencils to dust, staring at a cracked whiteboard where Caleb asked the same impossible question every year. What do you see that no one else sees? Because that was always the point. He wasn't trying to prove brilliance anymore. He was trying to build the lens for it. He made sure every kid walked out knowing one thing: you don't need permission to be undeniable. One fall afternoon, Caleb sat on the front steps of the Unlocked Room, watching the sunset scatter against the building's patched-up windows. A student sat beside him, 10 years old, wearing shoes a size too big, and a sweater stretched at the sleeves. She was quiet for a while. Then she asked, "Is it true you used to be famous?" Caleb chuckled. "Some people thought so. They said you were on TV and stuff." He shrugged. "Yeah, once." She frowned. "But why did they hate you?" Caleb looked at her. It was the kind of question only a child could ask without malice, without layers. Just raw, honest confusion. "Because I didn't stop when I was supposed to," he said softly. She tilted her head. "But you were right, weren't you?" He nodded slowly. "I was. But being right isn't always enough when you look like me." She thought about that, then said, "I want to be right too." Caleb smiled. "Then let's start with this," he said, reaching for his notebook. "Ever heard of the Monty Hall problem?" As they cracked it together, he felt the quiet settle again. Not peace, but purpose. And that was enough. One winter later, on the last day of camp, a tall teenager stood at the board, solving a logic puzzle Caleb had used as his own entry test 10 years earlier. She got it wrong the first time, right the second. By the third attempt, she had refined it to a level Caleb hadn't seen before. He clapped once. "Beautiful." She smiled. Proud, but not cocky. As the others packed up, she lingered. Then asked, "How did you stay so calm that day when the world laughed at you?" Caleb looked up, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" She nodded toward the poster on the back wall, a still from his Geneva presentation, where he stood at the board, Whitlock blurred in the background, face unreadable. "You didn't flinch," she said. "I watched the video. You just kept going." Caleb leaned back, thought about it, then said, "Because I wasn't doing it for them." She frowned. "Then who?" He looked at her, and answered the only way he knew how. "For the kid who comes next." That night, Caleb received a letter postmarked from Boston, stamped with the seal of Hanover Prep. Inside, an invitation and an apology. The day he returned to the Olympiad as a judge was crisp, with that brittle late spring air that feels like hope and tension colliding. The hallways of the convention center in Boston looked the same. Tall ceilings, light flooding through glass, banners of past competitions, portraits of past titans, of math. But everything looked different to Caleb Sanders, because now he belonged. He entered the judge's lounge, walking past familiar faces who once ignored him. Some paused, some bowed their eyes, some even offered handshakes, uncertain, hesitant. He didn't respond to all, he just kept walking, shoulders back, his stride steady. At the head table sat the current director of Olympiad, flanked by academic sponsors and dignitaries. In the center was the new framed photo, Caleb's face, calm, confident, holding up a board with his signature method elegantly displayed. It hung where once Whitlock's portraits had lined the wall. Students filed in for the final round of what would now be called Caleb Sanders Cup, Inspirational Edition. They sat nervously, calculators in hand, pens clicking, eyes darting. Caleb took his seat behind them, among the judges' panel. Youngest judge in Olympiad history, the only student ever to judge the event he once competed in. He watched them, not as an outsider, but as someone who had once sat where they were, hoping for a chance, hoping for the board to see past his clothes, his origin, his skin. The round began. A hush fell. The questions were complex, not cruel, not impossible, but meant to challenge. He saw hands tremble, eyes narrowing, students pausing at steps that should have been routine. He recognized the pause pattern recognition, doubt, hesitation. He leaned forward. He was supposed to judge, not help. But he whispered, under his breath to himself, "You know this. Don't fear the silence." One by one, the contestants rose and went to the board. The hall filled with the scratching of pens, the hum of computation, the quiet exhale when a line finally connects. He watched as a girl from a public school district, hooded sweatshirt pulled tight, walked to the board. She seemed uncertain, tentative. But she placed one line, then another, a glance upward, a tear almost held back, and then she continued. He smiled inwardly. The evaluation phase came. Judges murmured, compared answers, marked scores. Caleb sat silent, reviewing, comparing, focusing not on error, but on originality, on intuition, on steps that might show creativity. Because his standard had changed. It wasn't about catching mistakes, it was about honoring the path. After scores were entered, the director turned to the judges. "Our new champion," she said, scanning names, "is from Jefferson County Public." A murmur, then cheers. The girl in hooded sweatshirt looked around, stunned. A teacher in the audience gasped. Caleb did not stand. He applauded, softly, sincerely. After the ceremony, the students gathered for photographs. Some came up to him. A boy in the back with nervous eyes said, "You were here as a kid, right?" Caleb nodded. "I watched your video when I was 15. You made me believe I could do this." The boy's voice quivered. Caleb nodded again, no words needed. In the boardroom, after the event, he walked past the judge's table and paused at Whitlock's empty chair. A vacant lectern, a never-restored nameplate. Whitlock's name had been removed entirely from the board's plaques. A former Olympiad administrator approached him quietly. "We had to make a decision," she said. "He never returned our messages about that hearing. He resigned. He disappeared from teaching." Caleb nodded, absorbing the weight of that. There was no vengeance, no gloating, only the quiet satisfaction of truth persevered. Later in the final signing ceremony, a moderator asked Caleb to give advice to the next unlikely genius, the student who doubted themselves before anyone doubted them. He stood. In that moment, the silent hall held its breath. He said simply, "Don't prove them wrong. Prove yourself right." A murmur spread. Some shifted in seats. Others smiled. But the words were not for them. They were for someone, somewhere, listening, who needed permission to exist. After the ceremony, media gathered, flashbulbs popped, reporters asked for soundbites. They asked about redemption. They asked about justice. They asked about his future. He answered calmly, "This day isn't for me. It's for every student told they don't belong. My work continues. Because brilliance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers and only those who listen know the future is already here." They asked for one more quote. He paused, looked at the new champion receiving a medal, then back at them. Sometimes being right isn't about proving it to others. It's about being true enough to yourself that nothing can ever erase it. As he walked away, media cameras trailing behind, he didn't look back. But someone did. From across the room, a silhouette stood in a doorway. Slim, shadowed. A man holding a letter, Whitlock perhaps. Or someone sent by him. Caleb's chest tightened. He almost turned. But he kept walking. Because he had learned that power isn't in confrontation. It's in consistency. Because sometimes, brilliance doesn't sound like thunder. Sometimes, it whispers. And only those willing to listen hear the future. And on that step, a new envelope in hand behind him. The next whisper waited. No one should have to stay silent just to stay safe. If this story made you think twice about who gets questioned and who gets believed, type yes. If you believe in justice, subscribe if this broke your heart.